This report was adapted from the documentary Nazi War Criminals Sentenced to Death and Their Requests for Clemency Verbatim by J.M. Mahler and is available in bookstores.
Adolf Eichmann, SS-Obersturmbannführer, head of the Eichmann Department. In addition to historical images and film recordings, this report was supplemented by modern AI-supported animations.
Eichmann, born in Solingen on the 19th of March 1906, was head of the Eichmann Department, which belonged to the Reich Security Main Office, from where the persecution and deportation of European Jews was organized. As a desk clerk, Eichmann was jointly responsible for the murder of an estimated 6 million people in Europe, which was largely occupied by the Nazi state. He is considered the personification of the sober official who becomes a mass murderer. In 1914, the Eichmann family moved to Linz, Austria, where his father took up a position as an accountant. After school, Eichmann began training as a mechanic, but dropped out. Instead, he made his money as a salesman and agent. In April 1932, Eichmann became a member of the Austrian NSDAP and the SS. And after the party was banned in Austria in June 1933, he went to Bavaria and joined the SS security service there in 1934 and went through various stations there. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, he was transferred as SD leader to the SS Upper Section Danube. During Kristallnacht, he commanded destruction units, and in August of that year, he set up the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Vienna, which organized and promoted the forced emigration of Austrian Jews. Another goal of the Central Office was to steal the assets of forced emigrants. In July 1939, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Prague was opened, which was based on the Vienna model. Later, these offices were also used for deportations to the extermination camps. At the beginning of 1940, he took over the management of the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Berlin and became head of Department 44, Eviction Matters, and the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration at the Reich Security Main Office. From July 1941, Eichmann was responsible for organizing the entire deportation of Jews in Germany and the occupied European countries, transport coordination, timetables, and train occupancy. After the Wehrmacht occupied Hungary on the 19th of 1944, the so-called Operation Margarethi, the approximately 230-strong Special Operations Command Eichmann was founded and was under his leadership. The aim was to eliminate and concentrate the Hungarian Jews from public life, then deport them and destroy them, with the exception of those who are fully able to work. By the 9th of 1944 alone, 437,402 Hungarian Jews had been brought to Auschwitz under Eichmann's leadership. Shortly before the end of the war, Eichmann went into hiding and posed as a certain SS-Obersturmbannführer Otto Eichmann, but he was taken prisoner by the Americans, but was able to escape and go into hiding again. After the war, he initially lived in Germany with forged documents until he emigrated to Argentina in 1950, where he lived and worked modestly in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement. After a few months, his wife and children followed him. In 1957, Eichmann gave an extensive interview to the National Socialist and former Nazi propagandist Wilhelm Sasson in Argentina, in which he freely commented on the persecution of the Jews and his role. So Eichmann said, "I have to tell you quite honestly, if we had killed 10.3 million Jews out of the 10.3 million Jews, I would be satisfied and say, well, we have destroyed an enemy." He further said, "We would have fulfilled our task for our blood and for our people, and for the freedom of the people if we had destroyed the cleverest spirit of the human spirits living today. Because that's what I told Stryker, what I've always preached. We're fighting against an opponent who, through thousands of years of training, is mentally superior to us." On the 11th of 1960, he was arrested by the Israeli Secret Service and flown to Israel. The Eichmann trial in the Jerusalem District Court, at which he pleaded not guilty, lasted from the 11th/4th to the 15th/12th of 1961. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On May 29, 1962, Eichmann wrote a handwritten multi-page request for clemency to the Israeli President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. Eichmann's wife and siblings also submitted applications, but they were all rejected. On the night of the 31st/5th to the 1st/6th, at 12:02 a.m., Eichmann was executed in the Ajalon prison in Ramla. For decades, his petition for clemency was considered lost until it resurfaced during digitization work in the presidential archives. On the occasion of the 71st anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, this document was published by Israel's President Reuven Rivlin.
To the President, I agree with my defense lawyer's request and would like to point out the following. The judges made a crucial error in their assessment of me, as they were unable to put themselves in the time and position in which I was during the trial years of war. The error is caused by the fact that only individual documents were presented in my proceedings, which, without connection to the entire command material, must give a false picture. It is not true that I was such a high-ranking personality that I could and would have pursued the persecution of the Jews independently. The fact that the judges ignored in their judgment clearly speaks against such an abundance of power. I never had such a high rank, which should have been associated with such decisive, independent powers. So I didn't give a single order in my own name, but always only acted on behalf of, in general. If, as the judges assumed, I had been the recognized zealous driver in the persecution of the Jews, this would also have been reflected in promotion and other benefits. But I was not given any advantage. It is also not true that I have never allowed myself to be influenced by human feelings. I immediately asked for a transfer under the impression of the outrageous atrocities I had experienced. Likewise, during my police interrogation, I revealed the previously unknown atrocities in order to help establish the truth as indisputable. I declare again, as I have already done in court, I abhor the atrocities committed against the Jews as the greatest crimes and consider it fair that the perpetrators of such atrocities are held responsible now and in the future. However, the line must be drawn between the responsible leaders and the people who, like me, merely had to be instruments of leadership. I was not a responsible leader, and therefore I do not feel guilty. I cannot accept the court's verdict as fair. I ask you, Mr. President, to make use of your right to clemency and order that the death sentence not be carried out. Adolf Eichmann, Jerusalem, May 29, 1962.
This report was adapted from the documentary Nazi War Criminals Sentenced to Death and Their Requests for Clemency Verbatim by J.M. Meller and is available in bookstores.
Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Wehrmacht Command Staff in the Wehrmacht High Command, or OKW for short. In the Nuremberg trial of the main war criminals, Jodl was sentenced to death by hanging. In addition to original recordings, this documentation was supplemented with computer-animated sequences.
The Nuremberg trials against the main war criminals were the first of 13 Nuremberg trials after the end of the Second World War, and they are considered a milestone in the history of international law. It lasted from the 20th 11th 45 to the 1st 10th 46, and a total of 24 leading politicians, military and Nazi officials were indicted. They were charged with 4 counts. First, development and execution of a plan to commit crimes against peace, the laws of war and humanity. Second, participation in the planning and waging of aggressive wars. Third, war crimes against members of enemy forces and civilians of occupied territories. Fourth, crimes against humanity, persecution, deportation, enslavement and murder of opposition members and civilian populations. In the end, there were 12 death sentences, 7 prison sentences, 3 acquittals, and 2 of the cases were closed without conviction. With the exception of the architect and armaments minister Albert Speer, Göring, and the head of the security police and the SD, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the other convicts submitted applications, either personally or on behalf of their defense lawyers, which could be submitted within 4 days to the Allied Control Council in Berlin, the military government for Germany. All requests were rejected, and the Nazi war criminals sentenced to death were handed over to the executioner and hanged on the 16th 1046 in the sports hall of the Nuremberg cell prison. Only 10 sentences could be carried out. The defendant Hermann Göring committed suicide with the help of a cyanide capsule just a few hours before the execution, and the defendant Martin Bormann, head of the party office, was convicted in absentia. What was not known at the time was that Bormann was long dead. His remains were discovered in Berlin in 1972 during construction work.
Jodl, born on May 10 in 1890, joined the Bavarian army as an ensign in 1910 and fought during the First World War, first on the Western Front, then in 1916 on the Eastern Front. In 1918 he returned to the Western Front as a general staff officer. After the First World War, Jodl was accepted into the reduced army of the Reichswehr in 1919. After the seizure of power, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and in 1935 to head of the National Defense Department in the Wehrmacht Command Office. At the beginning of 1938, the Wehrmacht leadership was reorganized, the High Command of the Wehrmacht OKW was founded and staffed with National Socialists loyal to the line. Jodl's department became part of the OKW. And while the Polish campaign was still planned by the Army High Command OKH, which was critical of a Western campaign, Hitler decided to have the Western campaign planned by Jodl and the OKW. After the victory over France, he was promoted to General of Artillery and became a close advisor to Hitler on military matters. And Joseph Goebbels also wrote in his diary on the 4th-12th. He is easy to work with because he is so reliable. Jodl was then involved in planning the campaign against the Soviet Union. The directive of the 18th-12th Verzug with the code name Case Barbarossa, which outlined the attack on the Soviet Union, came largely from him and his staff. However, during the summer offensive of 1942, Case Blau, the relationship between Hitler and Jodl deteriorated, as Jodl repeatedly criticized Hitler's decisions. He then planned to have Jodl replaced by General Paulus as soon as he had conquered Stalingrad. Despite these tensions, he received the Gold Party badge of the NSDAP on the 30th day of 1943. He was promoted to Colonel General exactly 1 year later. On the 28th of 1944, Alfred Jodl then commanded Operation Nordlicht. The 20th Mountain Army was supposed to withdraw from the extreme northwest of Russia to northern Norway, and in order to deprive the advancing Russians and Norwegian partisans of any chance of survival there, all civilians were forcibly evacuated as part of Operation Northern Lights. It is estimated that there were 43,000 people whose homes, businesses, schools, churches and entire villages were set on fire or blown up and turned into its scorched earth area. On the 6th day of 1945, Jodl was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross by Grand Admiral Donitz. The very next day, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender in Reims. At trial he was found guilty on all 4 counts. In addition to his lawyer and his wife, Jodl also wrote a request.
Nuremberg, 4th 10th, 1946. To the Control Council in Germany, via the Secretary-General of the Military Court in Nuremberg. Before my death, I make a twofold request to the High Control Council. First, I ask that my body be cremated and my ashes either given to my wife Louise Jodl, or sent to the Frauenwerth Cemetery Administration on the Fraueninsel am Chiemsee, Post Prien. On this island, in my homeland, I acquired a grave in which my first wife, who died in 1944, rests. I would also like to find my final resting place there. Apart from my wife and the cemetery administration, no one needs to know about it, and no inscription on the cross that is already there needs to announce it. Second, I ask that the private items I had in my cell, letters, calendars, latest records, photographs, fountain pens, books, wallet, wedding ring, etc. do not go out into the world as souvenirs, for which they are only a sensation, but are handed over to my wife, for whom they represent holy relics. If the same thing could happen with my suitcases, I would love it, because we lost everything in Berlin. By fulfilling these 2 wishes, you would bring a reconciling element to the tragic end of a German officer who loved his people and his fatherland more than a new world order and a new international law consider permissible. My wife would thank you for this act of philanthropy. A Jodl, Colonel General A.D.
Jodl's wife Louise also submitted a request. She wrote, Nuremberg, the 5th 10th 1946. To the Allied Control Council for Germany Berlin. Gentlemen Generals, they are all soldiers. They all know that the soldier is obliged to use all his strength for the defense in peace and for the existence of his fatherland in war. It was in this belief that my husband, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chose the officer's profession. In this belief, when he took over his position as Chief of the Wehrmacht Command Staff, he used all his skills as a General Staff Officer, as each of you, gentlemen generals, did as a soldier in the war. Executing a General Staff Officer as a criminal who has done nothing other than fulfill the tasks assigned to him will be seen as unjust and humiliating by all soldiers in the world. And every soldier who feels called to be a military leader will ask himself whether he might not be destined for the same fate. I ask you from the bottom of my heart, as this man's wife, to do justice to these feelings when reviewing the verdict, as well as the fact that Jodl, in his inner integrity, his exemplary view of duty and as a straight, decent soldier, was adored and loved by his subordinates like no other, as can be seen from numerous letters. This is not just about my husband's life, but equally about his honor as an officer. I ask that the death penalty be abolished. Louise Jodl.